The billionaire CEO Jackson Westbrook woke to the soft hum of the mansion's cooling system. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the sleek, modern furniture. For all the elegance and luxury surrounding him, it felt like a tomb. In this gripping and emotional tale, Jackson Westbrook, a powerful billionaire tech mogul, has everything a man could want: wealth, status, and control. But behind the polished exterior lies a darker side, one fueled by manipulation and ruthless tactics. For years, Jackson has ruled over his wife, Ella, with an iron fist, her silence his greatest weapon. She has always been the obedient wife, playing her role in his twisted game of dominance. But everything changes when Ella goes missing, leaving behind only a chilling silence and unanswered questions. As the truth begins to unravel, Jackson's twin sister, Sophie, an FBI agent, is forced to confront her own brother's dark secrets. She soon discovers that Jackson's empire was built not just on business deals, but on lies, manipulation, and the destruction of lives, including Ella's. Sophie's investigation reveals a side of Jackson she never imagined, and as she unearths the horrifying truth, the question remains: will Sophie be able to bring her twin brother to justice for his countless wrongdoings? Will Ella, who has suffered in silence for so long, find the strength to expose the man who has tormented her for years? And as Jackson's empire crumbles around him, will he be able to control the fallout, or has he finally lost everything? Click the subscribe button as we delve into a story of betrayal, power, and revenge. A billionaire's world is about to fall apart. Will anyone get the justice they deserve? Will Ella find the strength to reclaim her life and bring down the man who tried to control her? He rose from his bed, slipping on his tailored robe. His eyes were still heavy from a restless night of barely sleeping, his mind racing over the meeting he had later today, a contract negotiation with his board members. But that wasn't what gnawed at him, it was the absence of Ella. She had always been the perfect wife, quiet, obedient, a little too compliant, but in a way that had worked for Jackson. It was a role she had played well, one that fed his need for control. But this morning, something was different. Her side of the bed was untouched, no apology breakfast waiting for him on the kitchen counter. The house felt too still. Jackson's steps grew heavier as he moved down the hall, his polished shoes clicking on the marble floors, each step a hollow echo. No Ella. A deep ache began in his chest, but he forced it away. This wasn't her usual disappearing act. She wouldn't run away like that. She wouldn't leave. She had too much to lose. He reached the kitchen, expecting to find her, perhaps preparing his usual breakfast, eggs, toast, coffee. But instead, the room was silent. The coffee pot was empty, the eggs left uncracked, the toast still sitting in the toaster, untouched. It felt like the silence in the room mocked him. Jackson's phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with an incoming call. Ella's name flashed. His heart skipped, and without thinking, he snatched the phone up, tapping the screen to answer. But there was no response. Just the soft click of voicemail, nothing. His fist clenched as reality sank in. She was gone. He couldn't understand it. Ella always came back. She always apologized after the silences, after the fights. She had no choice but to come back. His breathing quickened, his thoughts spiraling as his hands began to tremble. He stormed toward the garage. He didn't even think about it. There had to be an explanation. She couldn't just leave, not like this. Meanwhile, Sophie Westbrook, sitting at her desk in her FBI office, was quietly sifting through files. She was deep in thought, processing evidence she had gathered for months. The names on the documents weren't unfamiliar. Jackson Westbrook had been under investigation for a while now. Sophie had spent so much of her career hiding her emotions, keeping her distance from the cases that felt too personal. But this was personal. Jackson wasn't just the tech mogul who had built an empire. He was her twin brother, the one who had shaped her life into something unrecognizable. She still remembered the nights when they were children, sitting side by side, dreaming of the future. Jackson had been everything to her her protector, her partner in crime, but the man who had walked into her life today was someone entirely different. The manipulation, the lies, and most of all, the abuse. Ella had been the one to carry the brunt of it, but Sophie knew. She knew too much. The phone rang. She grabbed it quickly. The familiar voice on the other end was all too casual. "Sophie, you need to check the files on Jackson. We're getting close." Sophie swallowed hard. She had been avoiding this call for days, knowing the time would come. But she had also been keeping her distance. She couldn't help it. Part of her still loved Jackson no matter what he had become. Her twin. But the other part, the professional part, knew Jackson was no longer the man she once trusted. The man who had always been there for her. "I know," Sophie said, her voice betraying none of the conflict she felt. "I'll finish the report soon. But we need to get to the bottom of this. I can't do it alone." The call ended, leaving her to sit in silence once more, a gnawing feeling of dread sinking deeper into her chest. Ella's disappearance was no coincidence. This wasn't just about a missing wife. It was the beginning of something much darker. And Sophie knew, deep down, that she couldn't hide from the truth any longer. As the morning stretched on, Jackson's panic started to feel like a physical weight on him. His strides grew faster as he moved from room to room, checking places he'd already looked, desperate for any sign of Ella. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison. "Ella?" he shouted, his voice trembling now. The silence that greeted him only made the fear burn deeper. "Where are you?" But the house remained quiet, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for him to face the truth. He had lost control. Jackson stood in the middle of his living room, staring at the empty space around him. The quiet was suffocating. His empire was nothing without her, without the stability she had brought him. The realization was slow, creeping through his thoughts like a shadow. She had left him. And for the first time, Jackson didn't know what to do next. The loss of Ella was not just personal, it was everything. The truth was now at the doorstep. Have you ever had to face the consequences of your actions when you realized someone you loved was slipping away? How did you cope with the fallout? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The air felt heavy as Jackson slammed the door of his mansion behind him, the echo reverberating in the hollow silence that had consumed his once perfect home. The whisper of footsteps, the quiet murmur of his wife's voice. All of it had gone, leaving only a chilling emptiness that he couldn't ignore. His chest tightened with each breath, and his hands shook as he clenched his fists. He had to find her. He couldn't lose control. He called again, his voice growing more desperate with each unanswered ring. The emptiness of the house was suffocating him, and the panic began to rise in his throat like bile. He knew this wasn't just a simple disappearance. Something had changed. This wasn't just another of Ella's silent treatments. Something was wrong. He checked the kitchen again, the cold coffee still sitting untouched on the counter. He couldn't stop the wave of anger that surged inside him. Ella's silence had always been her weapon, but this time it felt too deliberate, too calculated. Meanwhile, Sophie was sitting she had left. Ella knew Jackson better than anyone, and that made him dangerous. He was ruthless, and not just in business. He had always been able to manipulate her, to make her feel small, insignificant. He had conditioned her to believe she had no value outside of the role he gave her, the perfect wife, the compliant partner. But this time, Ella had made a choice. She had seen too much, known too much, and her silence had become the prison she was stuck in. For the first time, she wasn't just the victim of his manipulation. She was the one in control. She held the key to everything, and that was the problem. Ella closed her eyes, running her hands over the old papers she had kept hidden, the ones that could bring Jackson down. They were carefully marked, each one a piece of a puzzle that told the truth about how Jackson's empire had been built. The illicit bribes, the secret transactions, the corrupt dealings that had lined his pockets while destroying lives. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. Complete control. Ella had the evidence that could take him down, but she knew the cost. If she exposed him, it wouldn't just be his empire that would fall. It would be everything they had built together, the facade of their marriage, their carefully curated life. It would be the end of Jackson Westbrook, the billionaire tech mogul, and it would tear Sophie's world apart too. But Ella couldn't live like this anymore. She couldn't keep running from the truth. Back in the mansion, Jackson paced back and forth, unable to sit still. The fear that had gripped him earlier was now morphing into rage. His empire was crumbling, and the only person who knew how to bring it all down was the one person he couldn't control anymore, Ella. The realization hit him like a cold slap across the face. Ella had been the key to his success, and now she was gone. Jackson grabbed his phone again, dialing Ella's number. It rang and rang and rang. No answer. His fingers tapped out a quick text, but still there was no response. He slammed the phone down on the counter in frustration. She was hiding, and he knew what she had, the evidence of everything. Sophie's phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. It was a message from an unknown number. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. It was short, just 2 words, but the meaning was clear. "I'm ready." Ella had made her choice. Sophie didn't hesitate. She stood up, determination solidifying in her chest. Ella was ready, and now they had to finish this, together. Jackson's empire was built on secrets, hidden truths that he had buried beneath layers of wealth and power. But now the walls were closing in. Sophie and Ella had the keys to his destruction, and he was losing control. Sophie, on the other hand, had made her choice. She was going to expose him, no matter the cost. She could feel the weight of the decision in her bones, but she knew it was the only way to move forward. This was no longer just about family, it was about justice. Jackson slammed his fist down on the desk, the sound echoing through the cold, quiet room. He couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, the weight of everything he had done pressing down on his chest. Ella was gone, and Sophie's investigation was getting dangerously close to the truth. His fingers trembled as he reached for the whiskey bottle sitting on the edge of his desk. It was his usual escape, his crutch, the one thing that had helped him get through the long nights of manipulation, of playing the game. But even as he poured the dark liquid into his glass, something felt off. He wasn't drinking to celebrate anymore. He was drinking to forget. Forget that his empire was crumbling. Forget that he had lost the one thing that had always kept him grounded. Ella. The phone buzzed on his desk. Sophie's name flashed on the screen. For a moment he just stared at it, the churning feeling in his stomach growing stronger. He had to answer. She was getting closer. Too close. Jackson picked up the phone, his voice steady but tinged with an edge he didn't want Sophie to hear. "Sophie," he said, his tone clipped, betraying the panic he was trying to control. "What do you want?" Sophie had been pacing the office for hours. The weight of the investigation, the truth about Jackson, felt like it was suffocating her. But she couldn't stop now. She had to keep moving, keep pushing forward. There was no turning back. When Jackson's name flashed on her screen, a sense of dread crept over her. This was it, the confrontation she had been avoiding. She answered the phone, her voice cold and steady. "Where is she, Jackson?" Jackson took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the glass. He needed control. He couldn't let her see the cracks forming beneath the surface. He had worked too hard for this moment to fall apart now. "I don't know where she is, Sophie," he said, his voice growing tense. "But I'm not the one you should be focused on. You need to let this go. You don't know what you're dealing with." Sophie's eyes narrowed, the words ringing in her ears. "Let it go?" she repeated. The anger in her voice flared. "You think I'm just going to let you get away with everything you've done?" She wanted to shout at him, to scream the truth at him, but instead, her voice came out cold and controlled, as though she had mastered the art of distance from her emotions. "You've been hiding behind your wealth and your power for far too long, Jackson. You're not getting away with it anymore. You're not just ruining people's lives. You've ruined ours too." A flash of something darker passed through Jackson's eyes. His fingers curled into a fist, and his voice dropped low, a growl of frustration and rage. "You think this is about me, Sophie? You think I'm the problem here?" His breath quickened. "You don't know what it's like to be accused of something you didn't do. You don't know what it's like to have your entire life fall apart because someone decided to believe the worst about you. I was just a kid when it happened, but it stayed with me, Sophie. It changed me. It made me who I am." Sophie felt the sting of his words, the guilt rising in her chest. She had heard the story before, the accusations that had torn their family apart. She had heard him justify it over and over, but it still didn't excuse the things he had done. The man sitting on the other side of this phone call wasn't the brother she had once loved. "That's not an excuse, Jackson," she said, her voice low and firm. "You didn't have to turn into this. You chose this. You chose to hurt people, and I'm done protecting you." The silence that followed felt like a dagger, each word hanging in the air between them. Jackson sat there, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Sophie's words had cut deep, deeper than he wanted to admit. He hadn't expected her to turn on him, not like this. He had spent years trying to control her, trying to make her believe that he was the victim in their family's story. But now, as the truth began to surface, he could feel it slipping away. He had built an empire on lies, on control. But Sophie was no longer afraid of him. "You don't understand, Sophie," he said finally, his voice quiet, almost pleading. "You've always been the good one, the obedient one. But I had to fight. I had to survive. You don't know what it was like to be thrown away, to be accused of something horrible. You don't know what it's like to carry that for the rest of your life." Sophie's chest tightened as his words hit home. She hadn't known what he had gone through, what shaped him into the man he had become. She had been too young to understand, too young to recognize the cracks in their family, but nothing could justify what he had done. Nothing. "I understand more than you think," Sophie said, her voice unwavering. "But that doesn't mean I'll let you get away with it. Not anymore." She ended the call, her heart racing. The weight of her decision hit her hard, the fear of what was to come sinking deep into her chest. Could she really bring him down? Could she expose the man who had once been everything to her? As Sophie put down her phone, she closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. Jackson's empire was crumbling, and Sophie could feel the weight of everything she had to do. The truth had to come out, there was no other choice. But as the realization settled in, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was only just beginning. The phone buzzed again, a message from Ella. Sophie hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm ready. We can bring him down, but we need to move fast." It was time. The truth was no longer optional. Sophie had never expected to be sitting across from Jackson again, not like this, not after everything. But here she was, the walls of the sterile conference room closing in around her, with Jackson on the opposite side of the table, his eyes dark and unreadable. The room was quiet, save for the low hum of the air conditioning and the sound of their breathing. Everything felt suffocating. It had only been hours since the FBI had raided Jackson's office, and now Sophie was meeting with him directly, face to face, as part of the investigation. The entire situation felt wrong, unnatural, but there was no turning back. She had made the decision. She had made the choice to bring him down, even if it meant destroying the last shred of family she had left. Jackson sat with his usual air of arrogance, his hands casually folded in front of him on the table. He looked the same, polished, controlled, as though nothing could touch him. But Sophie could see it. The tremble in his fingers, the way his eyes flicked to the door every now and then, as though expecting someone to come in and rescue him from this meeting. Sophie's chest tightened. She could feel the old guilt trying to creep up on her, the voice that whispered in the back of her mind, telling her that maybe, just maybe, Jackson wasn't as evil as everyone said. She'd known him as a brother once, the person who shared her childhood and her memories. She had wanted to believe that the man sitting before her now was someone she could still reach. But that hope had died years ago. Jackson had shown her his true nature long before this. Jackson didn't speak right away. Instead, he let the silence hang in the air, thick and suffocating. Sophie stared at him, her mind racing with all the questions she had never been able to ask. She had wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but the truth was too painful. It was easier to focus on the case, on the lies he had built his empire on. She didn't want to let her emotions distract her, but it was impossible not to feel the sting of betrayal when she looked at him. This man, who had been her twin, her partner in crime, now sat before her as the enemy. The weight of everything she had uncovered, the corruption, the manipulation, pressed down on her. Jackson finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "You don't understand, do you, Sophie? You're making a mistake." Sophie leaned forward, her voice sharp as she responded, "No, Jackson, I'm not making a mistake. You've lied to everyone. You've lied to me, and I'm done. You'll face the consequences now." Jackson's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Sophie saw the flicker of something, fear, pass across his face. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the mask of control he had perfected over the years. "You don't know what it's like, Sophie," he said, his voice quieter now, tinged with something almost pleading. "You don't know what it's like to be accused of something you didn't do, to have your whole life taken from you because of a lie." Sophie's chest tightened at the words, at the memory of their mother's accusations, of the night their family had fractured, but she couldn't let herself sympathize with him. Not anymore, not after everything. "You don't get to play the victim anymore, Jackson," she replied, her voice firm. "You're the one who chose this path. You're the one who turned your back on everyone who ever loved you." There was a long, painful silence between them. Jackson didn't respond right away. His gaze seemed distant, as though he were lost in thought. But Sophie knew better. He was calculating, weighing his options, trying to find a way to twist the situation in his favor. He leaned back in his chair, a bitter smile curling on his lips. "You really think you can bring me down, don't you?" His voice was sharp, but beneath it Sophie could hear something else, desperation. She wasn't fooled. She knew this game. He always played the victim, the one who was misunderstood. But Sophie wasn't buying it anymore. The moment had come. The truth would come out, and Jackson Westbrook would have to face it. Jackson's hands trembled as he stared at the paper. Her hands clenched into fists, the anger rising in her chest. "This isn't about me, Jackson. This is about Ella. It's about everything you've done to her, to me, to everyone you've manipulated. You've built your empire on lies, and now it's crumbling." Jackson stood up suddenly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Sophie flinched at the sound, but Jackson's sudden movement was more than just a physical shift. It was a reaction, a shift in the power dynamic that had defined their relationship for years. His eyes were dark, filled with rage. But beneath the anger, Sophie saw something else, something that made her heart stop for a moment. There was a flicker of fear in his eyes. The man who had always been in control, the man who had ruled his world with an iron fist, was now facing something he couldn't control. "Sophie, you don't understand," he said through clenched teeth. "You don't know what I've been through. I had to fight for everything, Sophie. I had to make it happen. Don't you see? You were always the good one, the obedient one, but I had to take it. I had to protect myself." Sophie stood up now, her stomach turning as his words landed. She had always believed him once. She had always excused him, telling herself that maybe there was a reason behind his actions. Maybe the pressure had been too much. But she couldn't excuse him anymore. "That doesn't give you the right to destroy people, Jackson," she said softly. "You had choices, and you chose to hurt people to get what you wanted, and now you'll face the consequences." The door behind them opened suddenly, interrupting the tense standoff. The FBI agents had arrived. Jackson's gaze shot to the door, his face pale. Sophie watched him carefully, noticing the way his body went stiff as the realization of what was happening settled in. He was being cornered, and there was nowhere left to run. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, wars on his desk. Old documents, family photos, and records that felt too heavy to touch. The past had a way of creeping up on him when he least expected it. Every page, every image, reminded him of a time he had tried so hard to bury. The room around him was suffocating. The walls of the mansion, which had once felt like a fortress, now seemed to press in on him. The air was thick with guilt, and it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. Every step he took, every glance he made, led him closer to the one thing he had spent years running from: the truth. His thoughts drifted back to the day everything had started to unravel. The day he had been accused of something unspeakable. He had been a teenager at the time, but the memory was still fresh. He could still hear the words his mother had screamed at him that night, the accusations that had shattered everything they had known. Flashbacks flooded his mind, his mother's tears, the shame that clung to him, suffocating him like a dark cloud. He had been accused of something that, to this day, he still couldn't do. Ella had suffered too. She had lived in silence for so long, trapped by Jackson's manipulation and control. But Sophie knew that exposing the truth wouldn't just bring Jackson down, it would bring freedom to everyone he had hurt. As Jackson sat in his office staring at the papers in front of him, he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The shame of his past was finally catching up with him. He had spent years trying to bury it, trying to control the narrative, but Sophie's investigation and Ella's disappearance had forced him to face it. He could feel the walls of his empire shaking, the truth coming for him, and this time there was no escape. The foundation he had built was cracked, and all it took was one more piece of the puzzle to bring it all down. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the floor, Sophie finally stood up, a sense of determination flooding through her. The truth was out. Jackson's empire was built on lies, and now it was time for him to pay the price. But as Sophie looked at the files before her, the weight of the truth hit her hard. Exposing Jackson would bring justice, but it would also destroy the last piece of family she had left. Was she ready to lose everything? There was no noise, no one else to witness the fragile piece they had created together. Sophie had invited Ella to meet her, knowing that the weight of their conversation would be too much to handle over the phone. It wasn't just about the investigation. It was about the truth, about everything that had been buried for years. Ella sat across from Sophie, her posture slightly slumped, as though the very act of sharing the truth had left her emotionally drained. Her face was tired, but there was a strength Sophie hadn't seen before. It was as though everything that had happened, everything they had been through, had led them to this moment. Sophie knew she had to ask the questions that had been burning in her chest since the moment she discovered Ella's disappearance was no accident. But it wasn't the questions about Jackson's empire that were consuming her. It was the deeper human connection, the years of silence between them that she needed to bridge. She took a deep breath and finally spoke, her voice gentler than she expected. "Ella, I need to know what happened. I need to know why you left." Ella's hands trembled slightly as she set the glass of water down. Her eyes, usually so guarded, were now vulnerable as she looked at Sophie. "I couldn't do it anymore," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I couldn't stay silent and watch everything crumble. I've been living in fear for so long. Fear of Jackson, fear of losing myself." Sophie nodded slowly, understanding. Ella's fear had shaped her life, just as Jackson's abuse had shaped their family. But Sophie could see that Ella had broken free. For the first time in years, she had taken control. Sophie's heart swelled with a strange mixture of sympathy and admiration. "You had to leave," Sophie said softly, though it wasn't just a statement, it was a realization. Ella wasn't just a victim. She had chosen to take action, and that made all the difference. Ella took a deep breath, her gaze drifting to the floor. She was still wrestling with the weight of everything she had been through, the years of mental abuse, the years of living under Jackson's thumb. But now, sitting in front of Sophie, it felt like a new beginning, a way forward. "I couldn't live in his shadow anymore," Ella said, her voice breaking. "Jackson has always been the center of attention. Everything revolved around him. but I was always in the background, just a pawn in his game. And I let him do it. I let him control me. Sophie watched her closely, trying to understand. She couldn't fully grasp what Ella had endured, but she knew the strength it took to speak out, to finally break free. Ella, you were never a pawn. You're not his puppet. You're not a victim anymore. Sophie's words were quiet, but they were filled with the weight of everything she had seen in the past few days. You were just too scared to see your own strength. Ella shook her head, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. You don't get it, Sophie. I was so afraid of losing him, of losing everything I thought I was supposed to be, the perfect wife, the perfect partner. Jackson had me believing that without him, I'd be nothing. Sophie reached out, placing her hand gently on Ella's. The gesture was small, but the connection it created was powerful. You're everything, Ella. You've always been enough. You were never just Jackson's wife. You were always your own person. It's just that you didn't realize it yet. The words hung between them, a fragile truth that Sophie knew was difficult for Ella to accept. But Ella was starting to believe it, just a little. She looked up at Sophie, her eyes searching for something. Hope, maybe, or just reassurance that she wasn't alone in this. I don't know what to do now, Ella admitted softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I never thought I'd get this far. I didn't know I had it in me to leave him. But now that I'm here, I don't know how to fix this, how to make things right. Sophie squeezed her hand. You don't have to fix anything, Ella. You just have to keep moving forward. We'll make sure Jackson faces what he's done. But you need to focus on you now. And we'll do this together. No more running. Ella looked up at Sophie, her eyes filled with something close to relief. Together then? Sophie nodded. Together. There was a brief silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The weight of their shared history hung between them, but there was something else now, something lighter. The heaviness of the past wasn't gone, but it had been acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement, there was the potential for healing. Suddenly the door opened, and Jackson walked in, his face shadowed with a mixture of rage and disbelief. His eyes darted between Sophie and Ella, and the look of betrayal on his face was unmistakable. He had walked into the room expecting to find control, expecting to maintain the illusion of power, but what he found instead was a challenge, one he didn't know how to face. What the hell is going on here? Jackson's voice was low, his fists clenched at his sides. What are you two plotting? Sophie stood up slowly, placing herself between Jackson and Ella, her stance protective, unwavering. We're not plotting anything. We're just getting the truth out there. And it's time for you to face the consequence. Jackson stepped forward, his eyes locked on Sophie. He was furious, but there was something else lurking beneath the surface, something more fragile than he was willing to admit. The walls he had built around himself had started to crumble, and for the first time, he could see just how much he had lost. You think you can bring me down with your little crusade? Jackson growled. You're nothing without me, Sophie. You're just a daughter, a sister. I made you who you are. Sophie's jaw tightened, but her response was calm, almost quiet. No, Jackson, you never made me. I'm me, and I'm stronger than you'll ever be. The moment Sophie entered the house, she knew something had changed. The air felt thick with tension, the once perfect space now filled with a sense of impending doom. The house was too still, the usual hum of life missing. And then she saw Jackson standing by the windows, his hands pressed against the glass as he stared out into the distance. He looked so small, so vulnerable, something she hadn't seen in years. But there was also a sense of desperation in him, something raw and human that made her heart ache. For just a moment, she almost wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but she couldn't, not anymore. Sophie. His voice broke the silence, and Sophie stiffened, not expecting him to speak first. She had imagined this moment for so long, this confrontation. where she would stand face to face with him and finally make him pay. But now that it was happening, she wasn't sure she was ready. "What are you going to do?" Jackson asked quietly, his voice low but laced with something almost pleading. "You think you can just destroy everything? My business, my life?" Sophie's breath caught in her chest, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This wasn't just about bringing him down. It was personal, and it was ripping her apart. Ella had been the one who had to endure his cruelty, but now Sophie was realizing that the manipulation, the emotional control, had reached them both. They were both his victims. And now, it was time for them to take their power back. "It's not about destroying you, Jackson," Sophie replied, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. She hated that she still felt this way, that she still cared. "It's about making sure you face the truth. You've built everything on lies and manipulation. People's lives have been ruined because of you." Jackson turned to face her, his expression a mixture of anger and something else. Fear. It was there, just beneath the surface, barely hidden. "You don't understand," he snapped, his voice rising. "I had to do it. I had no choice. I had to fight for everything." But his words sounded like excuses, like something he had told himself so many times that he could no longer tell the difference between the truth and the lies he had woven around himself. Sophie had heard him make these same excuses for years. He was the victim in his own story, and no matter how many times she tried to show him the truth, he would never accept it. "You did this, Jackson. No one forced you to hurt people. No one forced you to take away everything from everyone you loved." At that moment, the door opened, and Ella stepped into the room, her presence almost ghostly. Sophie hadn't expected her to come here. Not like this. The tension in the room grew, and for a brief second all three of them stood frozen. Ella's eyes met Sophie's. There was something unspoken between them, something that had been building for so long. For the first time, Ella wasn't just the silent victim. She was here, standing next to Sophie, ready to expose the man who had destroyed them both. But Jackson didn't see it. His gaze snapped toward Ella, and his voice broke with emotion. "You left me. You left me, Ella. After everything I've done for you, you left." Ella didn't flinch. She didn't react. She simply stood there, the weight of the years between them heavier than ever. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but resolute. "You think I owe you something? You think you can control me anymore, Jackson?" Ella took a step forward, her posture straightening, as though shedding the years of fear and subjugation. "You never loved me. You loved the idea of having control. You loved having someone to manipulate, someone to keep you on top. And I was just that, someone you could control. But not anymore. I'm done." Jackson's face twisted, and his jaw tightened, a vein bulging in his neck. "You don't understand," he said again, this time more forcefully. "You'll regret this. You think you can just walk away from me, but I've built this empire. I've given you everything. You'll ruin everything you've worked for, everything I've worked for. You'll be nothing without me." Sophie stepped forward, her hand clenched into a fist, but she didn't flinch. "You never gave me anything. You took everything from me. And I won't stand by while you destroy everyone else." Jackson's face went pale, his control slipping away. His empire, the empire that had been built on his need for control, on his manipulation of everyone around him, was crumbling. The weight of his past mistakes was catching up with him. And Sophie and Ella were both standing before him, ready to take him down. But the reality of his downfall didn't hit him until Sophie looked him in the eyes and said, "The truth is out, Jackson, and you can't run from it anymore." Jackson staggered backward, his knees almost giving out beneath him. His hand shot out to catch the edge of the table, his knuckles going white. Sophie could see it now, the terror behind his eyes. He had always been the one in control, but now he was facing the consequences of everything he had done. And for the first time in his life, Jackson realized there was no way to escape what was coming. His empire was over. The secrets he had buried so deep, The lies he had built his life around, they were all coming to light. Ella knew. Sophie knew. Jackson Westbrook's world was collapsing. The cold, sharp click of the phone hanging up echoed through the quiet room. Sophie stared at the screen, the finality of Jackson's message hitting her like a punch in the gut. "I know." The weight of those two words kept ringing in her ears. She had made her choice. She had exposed him, but the cost had been higher than she expected. Ella stood beside her, her face drawn but resolute. The bond between them had been forged in the fire of shared pain, but the road ahead still felt uncertain. Jackson's empire was unraveling, and yet Sophie felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, the ground beneath her feet slowly crumbling away. As Sophie paced the floor of her apartment, her mind raced. The final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, but there was still so much left to unravel. Jackson had tried to control everything in his life, from his empire to the people around him, but now he was losing control. Sophie's heart still hurt as she thought of the man who had once been her twin brother, the one who had shared her life, her memories, her dreams. The man who had now become the very thing she had spent years trying to avoid, a monster. But it wasn't just Jackson she had to worry about anymore. The truth had come out, and there was no going back. The files she had on Jackson's corruption, the illegal transactions, the bribes and the manipulation would expose everything. He could no longer run from the consequences of his actions. But as the weight of everything settled into her chest, Sophie couldn't help but feel a surge of guilt. Was there a way to fix this? Could she have stopped it all from happening? Could she have saved him? Ella sat quietly in the corner, her eyes dark with fatigue. She had spent years hiding from Jackson's manipulation, years living in fear. But now she was facing the consequences of her own choices. Leaving Jackson had been the hardest thing she had ever done, but it had been the only thing that had allowed her to survive. Now, she was part of the reckoning. The two women had fought side by side, but now Sophie could see how much this was affecting Ella. The fear that had once controlled her was starting to fade, but the emotional cost of their fight was just beginning to show. Ella spoke quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this, Sophie. I don't know if I'm ready to face everything he's done. I still hear his voice in my head, telling me I'm nothing without him." Sophie's heart broke as she turned to her. She had always thought of Ella as the strong one, the one who could handle anything, but now she could see the deep wounds that Ella had buried for so long. "You're not nothing, Ella. You're more than what Jackson made you believe. You're free now. You don't have to live in his shadow anymore." Sophie's voice was low but filled with conviction. "We're in this together." The room fell silent as Jackson's words echoed in both of their minds. He had made them both believe they were nothing without him, that their worth was tied to his success. But Ella was reclaiming her life, and Sophie was finally confronting her brother's sins. They were both learning that they were more than the roles Jackson had forced them into. As the silence stretched, Sophie's phone buzzed. A message from Jackson. His words were simple, but they sent a chill down Sophie's spine. "I can fix this. It doesn't have to end like this, Sophie. You're my sister. Don't do this." Her heart fluttered in her chest. It was hard to ignore the pull of family, the years of memories they shared. Jackson had been the one who protected her as a child, but that protection had always come at a cost. And now, Sophie had to make the hardest choice of her life. Did she choose the man she had once loved, or did she choose justice? She stared at the phone screen, her heart torn between the brother she had once known and the man he had become. Sophie's fingers hovered over the phone for a moment. She could feel the weight of the decision, the emotional consequences that would come with either choice. The past was calling her, begging her to turn away from the truth. But she knew deep down that there was no turning back. She tapped out her response, her fingers steady despite the turbulent storm raging inside her. "I can't fix this, Jackson. You had your chance. You can't keep hiding behind your wealth and power. You'll face the truth now." She hit send. The phone slipped from Sophie's hand as she stood there, staring at the message she had just sent. The finality of it hit her like a punch to the gut. She had made the decision. Her family would never be the same again. But the truth had to come out. Jackson had made his choices. Now, Sophie had made hers. Sophie turned to Ella, her voice barely a whisper. It's over. The world didn't stop for Jackson, but it did slow down. His empire, once built on lies and manipulation, had now begun to fall apart. News outlets were reporting on the investigations into his company's illegal dealings. The truth about his past, about his empire, was out in the open for everyone to see. Ella and Sophie stood together, watching the wreckage unfold before them. For the first time in years, they both felt a sense of peace, the peace that came with knowing they had done the right thing. Justice had finally been served. Inside the Westbrook mansion, Jackson sat alone in his study. He had been stripped of his empire, his wealth, and his influence. He had lost everything, and for the first time in his life, he could no longer hide behind his power. Over the phone for a moment, she could feel the weight of the decision, the emotional consequences that would come with either choice. The past was calling her, begging her to turn away from the truth, but she knew, deep down, that there was no turning back. She tapped out her response, her fingers steady despite the turbulent storm raging inside her. I can't fix this, Jackson. You had your chance. You can't keep hiding behind your wealth and power. You'll face the truth now. She hit send. The phone slipped from Sophie's hand as she stood there, staring at the message she had just sent. The finality of it hit her like a punch to the gut. She had made the decision. Her family would never be the same again. But the truth had to come out. Jackson had made his choices. Now, Sophie had made hers. Sophie turned to Ella, her voice barely a whisper. It's over. The world didn't stop for Jackson, but it did slow down. His empire, once built on lies and manipulation, had now begun to fall apart. News outlets were reporting on the investigations into his company's illegal dealings. The truth about his past, about his empire, was out in the open for everyone to see. Ella and Sophie stood together, watching the wreckage unfold before them. For the first time in years, they both felt a sense of peace, the peace that came with knowing they had done the right thing. Justice had finally been served. Inside the Westbrook mansion, Jackson sat alone in his study. He had been stripped of his empire, his wealth, and his influence. He had lost everything, and for the first time in his life, he could no longer hide behind his power. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to find Sophie standing in the doorway. She didn't look like the woman who had once been his twin sister. The anger in her eyes had replaced the admiration she once held for him. "This is it, Jackson," Sophie said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "You've been exposed. You can't run anymore." Jackson's face was pale, his lips trembling as he stood up. He had no words left. Sophie had done what he never thought she could. She had brought him down, exposed the very empire he had spent years building. Ella was finally free, but Sophie wasn't finished. "You'll never hurt anyone again. The truth is out. Your empire is over." Jackson collapsed into the chair. Behind him, defeated, he had finally lost control. The man who had once stood tall, the one who had been so sure of his power, was now a shell of the man he had been. Sophie and Ella stood together, side by side, watching him, the weight of everything they had been through heavy on their hearts. But they were free, free from him, free from the lies, the manipulation, and the darkness that had once defined their lives. As the last vestiges of his empire crumbled, Sophie and Ella walked out of the room together, knowing they had done the right thing. The truth had won. What does justice really mean to you? Can you truly forgive someone who has hurt you, or is there a point where forgiveness is no longer possible? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Over the phone for a moment, she could feel the weight of the decision, the emotional consequences that would come with either choice. The past was calling her, begging her to turn away from the truth, but she knew deep down that there was no turning back. She tapped out her response, her fingers steady despite the turbulent storm raging inside her. "I can't fix this, Jackson. You had your chance. You can't keep hiding behind your wealth and power. You'll face the truth now." She hit send. The phone slipped from Sophie's hand as she stood there, staring at the message she had just sent. The finality of it hit her like a punch to the gut. She had made the decision. Her family would never be the same again. But the truth had to come out. Jackson had made his choices. Now, Sophie had made hers. Sophie turned to Ella, her voice barely a whisper. "It's over." The world didn't stop for Jackson, but it did slow down. His empire, once built on lies and manipulation, had now begun to fall apart. News outlets were reporting on the investigations into his company's illegal dealings. The truth about his past, about his empire, was out in the open for everyone to see. Ella and Sophie stood together, watching the wreckage unfold before them. For the first time in years, they both felt a sense of peace, the peace that came with knowing they had done the right thing. Justice had finally been served. Inside the Westbrook mansion, Jackson sat alone in his study. He had been stripped of his empire, his wealth, and his influence. He had lost everything, and for the first time in his life, he could no longer hide behind his power.